research that I've done. My resources are taken from the archives of the newspapers, a lot of the files from the Douglas County Historical Society, and by studying the lakes and I guess the actual deal is I get to enjoy the lakes just like you do here in this community. And so I do spend a lot of time reading, and I like to refer to local historians and things that have been written in the past. And as we begin tonight, just think about Harold Anderson wrote at one time, the place had been here for a long time. It was a small place, really, a little bit of virgin land, prairie held loosely in the fingers of a chain of sparkling blue lakes clothed in gloves of the dark green foliage of oaks and other trees that grew along the shores. And I want to, there we go. Today we are like spectators watching this parade of life march by us, and we can only look, reflect, and kind of float along. We cannot see everything. We will not see everything tonight either, yet a few photographs will give us a perspective of the opportunities that the lake regions offered from the very beginning of the settlements here, and what the legacy of our lake history brings to the community today. And I think one of the words that you're going to hear me talk a little bit like quite often this evening is going to be the potential that our settlers and the people, our forefathers, all saw in this area, and how that has continued through the years. The potential of many ways that our lakes and our legacy can make this community what it is today and what it has given us in the past. So we start at the very beginning. The name Minnesota comes from the Ojibwe Indian language meaning many waters. Minnesota became a state in 1858, and Alexandria has produced one governor, Senator Canute Nelson, whose bronze statue stands before the Capitol in St. Paul, and whose house is the headquarters for the Douglas County Historical Society. Douglas County, of which Alexandria is the county seat, was named for the Senator Stephen A. Douglas, who pushed through the resolution to make Minnesota a state. Alexandria had two settlement periods. You've probably heard this before, but the first one began in 1857 when the Kincaid brothers, Alexander and William Kincaid of Delaware, came and built the first home on Lake Agnes for their brother, George. Alexandria is named for the Kincaid brother, Alexander, who was the first postmaster. The brothers did not stay long. They were surveyors laying out a road. However, both enlisted in the Civil War when Lincoln called for a Minnesota militia, and they left this settlement. The first settlement period lasted until 1862, during which time the Sioux outbreak, some people call it the Dakota Uprising, drove nearly all of the residents out of this area. Douglas County was not yet a set county. Our government was governed under Stearns County until 1866 when our county borders were established. And Alexandria was not incorporated as a city until 1877. But from 1862 to 1866, the territory was practically depopulated and deserted because of the Civil War and the Dakota Uprising. A company of soldiers from Company K built a stockade on the hill up from Broadway on 3rd Avenue, where we see Christopherson's Bait located today. Douglas County is said to have over 200 lakes, and a majority of the lakes bear family names of the early settlers, while a few are named for their contours. Some are named by Indian names. I could spend a whole hour just talking about how the lakes got their names, but if we have time, maybe we can go back to some questions that you might have about that. So let's just think now, how did everybody find out about Alexandria after the Civil War and the Indian Uprising? Remember, almost everybody left. So we had a second start to the settlement, which is credited to William Everett Hicks. He gave it its second start. He was encouraged by his doctor out east to go west, where the air was clean and the water was pure. And this is how far he got, on the west side of Lake Agnes, just like the Kincaid brothers. And he soon settled here. William Everett Hicks, as I said, is credited with giving Alexandria its second start, and we're very lucky that he didn't decide to change the name of Alexandria with his name. I guess it could be Hicksville, but we're happy with Alexandria. And so he is credited also with bringing businessmen to the area where they found pleasure in hunting and fishing and leisure. And although tourism today is a year-round business because of our lakes, back in the day, life would go into high gear summer, we go into high gear right around May 1st and continue on through the hunting season of fall. All that was needed back in the day was a cot or a bed, a tent, a table, kerosene, cook stove, and meager supplies. The first settlers in Alexandria after 1866 were mostly English, and they were from the East, and most of them were wealthy and had money. In 1871, the Alexandria Post said, "Alexandria as a summer resort compares in its air to sunny Italy. Indeed, the whole of Douglas County seems to be intended for one grand pleasure garden. We have scenery which, though we cannot call it either grand or majestic, is not surpassed for its loveliness." And that pretty much says it all in a nutshell, and how we grew. Word of mouth must have spread. The first vacationers who came must have agreed. They went home and told their friends, and their friends told their friends, and soon there was a large clientele arriving every May for the summer season. All of the citizens of Douglas County were engaged in the various activities that were a part of the development of the rapidly growing town and the surrounding agricultural community. Hard work occupied most of the waking hours of the people, and there was little time for recreation. So when there was time for recreation, the people who lived here enjoyed the lakes. People uniformly kept Sunday for a rest, whether they went to church or not, and other activities of the day provided some respite. Some of the heavy work periods were seasonal, and some of them depended on the weather. And there was recreation for all seasons here in this area. Picnicking, boating, swimming, skiing, skating, sledding, ice fishing, tobogganing. All the seasons were covered. Men and boys and ladies alike liked to fish and trapped for food and fun, and the season actually brought the recreation, and the recreation brought the tourism, and the tourism started at the very beginning of Alexandria. Since Alexandria was circled by Lake Winona, Lake Agnes, and Lake Henry, they became fine and good fishing lakes, and those who maintained boats had sheltering boathouses along its shores. In those days, there were grades or bridges to partition off the lakes, providing easier access to the lakes. And just one side note, Lake Agnes on all the early maps is included in what is now called Lake Henry. Of course, growing tourism brought a growing need for accommodations, hotels specifically. Thus, the early resort history began. It was clear from the beginning of the settlement that the lakes were not only for those who lived in the area, but for the visiting folks as well, the city folk. The first settlers came by ox cart, and the stagecoach brought the first businessmen and tourists. The Alexandria Post often carried ads inserted by people from Minneapolis or St. Paul and other cities inquiring about quarters for summer boarders close to a lake. The railroad reached St. Cloud in 1866, and so thereafter, a trip from Alexandria to St. Paul could be considerably shortened in the amount of time consumed. They came by stagecoach for the rest of the way. One of the first hotels was the Minnesota House, which is pictured here in the center of the block on the west side. It had a stable in the rear. There was a livery stable behind this hotel. And the Minnesota House was located on where Broadway is today, basically where the Andrea Theater is located. In the 1870s, the Wissahickon and the Douglas House, and of course the Minnesota House, were hosts to sportsmen from far away and became stagecoach stops. Railroad lines reached Melrose by 1872, and so there was a lot of excitement about what the possibilities and again the potential of what Alexandria would have once the rails came through. So people were very excited. In fact, when it reached Melrose in 1872, they went out basically and met it and then thought, well, now we are finally going to get our railroad by 1873. Unfortunately, the funds ran out and all of the construction stopped until Knute Nelson stepped in and got it going again. So the funds became available, but it wasn't until November 5th of 1878 that the rail first arrived in Alexandria. It was a wood-burning Great Northern locomotive pulling a little string of wooden cars and coaches, and it reached Alexandria. And it did have a supply for Cowing Robards. And Cowing Robards, of course, has the distinction of being the oldest business on Broadway in the same exact location where it started in the beginning. So they had a load of sundries and supplies of about $14 worth for Cowing Robards on that first rail that reached Alexandria. So this, of course, the railroad was the link to the outside world, and it really started the development of our area. Produce grown on the farms could be sent to markets, and people could ride the cars instead of the stage. And men from cities began to travel to the lake country to hunt and fish, and the tourist industry was given another boost. Tourism and agriculture became the basic industries of Douglas County. Meanwhile, before that, there was a man by the name of J.H. Letson, which if you've gone through this museum, you've heard of Letson because there's a wonderful exhibit here that describes the resort history here at the museum. And Mr. Letson operated a summer resort at Excelsior in Lake Minnetonka. And he is considered one of our pioneers in really promoting the potential of the resort industries in Douglas County. In the summer of 1880, a group of railroad men came to Letson's resort on Lake Minnetonka and suggested that they take a trip to a more remote area in the state. And they thought about coming here. So Mr. Letson accompanied them to the wilderness of Alexandria, surrounding the village, and they were so pleased with what they saw that Mr. Letson decided to sell his property in Minnetonka and build his dreams and his goals and his potential and his achievements right here in Alexandria. Now, meanwhile, when the railroad arrived, people were enjoying the lakes on their own, especially just people who lived here. At the same time, they were being encouraged to keep their lakes clean. And I found this really, really a very important part of our history, because back in 1878, the Alexandria newspaper encouraged businessmen and men of means to look after the lakes and encourage tourism, but also to remind them to not only enjoy nature, but to keep our lakes and waters clean. The 1878 story in the Alexandria newspaper speaks volumes even now, and this is what it said. Here in the center of this broad park region, amid forest and prairie, purling streams and picturesque lakes, is nature's grandest, purest, never-tailing hygiene. The charms of landscape and climate, the diversified amusements, replete in health-giving pleasure and free from danger, revive the spirits of the drooping invalid, make the toil-worn businessman forget his cares, give fresh bloom to the rose on beauty's cheek, add new vigor to the hale and strong and lengthened days to all. And the time is near at hand when all round these circling lakes, embraced in shady groves, the white tents and summer cottages of health and pleasure seekers may be counted by numbers. The lakes forming the chain encourage and circle the village of Alexandria. Let's keep them clean. Encircling Alexandria was indeed Lakes Winona, Henry, Agnes. Alexandria was the county seat of Douglas County. So just think how the legacy of the lakes from the very beginning was what really developed the potential of what we could offer to not only our residents here, but to visiting folks as well. And almost about 100 years later in the Alexandria newspaper, 1970, 50 years ago to be exact, is when the sewer district began its work in keeping our lakes clean. And I think that's really important to remember. So back to Mr. Letson, he was so charmed by the area that he made immediate plans to build a hotel in Alexandria after his first initial trip out here. And so he is credited with giving us the first grand hotel, and he named it the Letson House. He built it a block off of Broadway. He bought the property on the southeast corner of the intersection of Fillmore Street and Lincoln Avenue, which is today known as 6th Avenue, a spot not far from the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba railroad tracks. He could pick guests up by horse and buggy at the railroad and bring them to his hotel. He began his construction of his hotel in 1879, and he opened it in 1881. Again, the Letson House from the first day of its opening was a success. The Letson House was known to every traveler in Minnesota, the Alexandria Post-News reported. So when Mr. Letson opened his Letson House in 1881, he realized there weren't enough rooms already to accommodate all the guests that wanted to come here. Indeed, the Letson House was so successful and business for him was so good in Alexandria that he found himself turning away long-time customers from his Excelsior days. So he knew right away that he had to do something. So he began plans for another resort hotel later on in a few years. But meanwhile, he had his grand opening here at the Letson House in Alexandria, and the Moorhead Argonaut newspaper contained an article about Alexandria, and it was entitled Alexandria. This is what it said: Alexandria is a summer resort on the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba Railroad with beautiful lakes and a good hotel. Alexandria is a village of about 1,500 inhabitants, the county seat and metropolis of Douglas County, and one of the principal towns on the Minneapolis-St. Paul, Manitoba Road. It is about 100 miles from Fargo, Moorhead, and Alexandria is naturally one of the finest summer resorts in the state, owing to the fact that there are 20 good-sized lakes within 5 miles of town, all surrounded by luxuriant groves and abounding in fish of the choicest varieties. There is no possibility of these lakes being fished out, as they all communicate and are fed by a river. Several parties there for the first time this season have had pronounced success, in some instances catching 400 pounds in one afternoon. There is a charming hotel not far from the shores of one of these lakes right in the town site called the Letson House. And that is taken from the 1881 issue, June 23rd, of the Moorhead Argonaut newspaper. So within 2 years, Letson bought a sizable piece of lakeshore on the south end of Lake Geneva and built Alexandria's first summer hotel, which he at first called Alexandria Hotel. And with this new hotel on Lake Geneva, a Great Northern Railroad flag stop left tourists just a few hundred feet off the hotel's front doors. You see, indeed, the resort hotel was so popular that the railroad built a side railroad track and also built a gazebo station, an ornately distinctive depot and loading platform for it. And you see it here in the lower picture. Trains stopped in early days to leave passengers at the hotel's front door, only 500 feet from the rail. And it was an excellent choice for Letson because it was easily accessible for fishermen to get to Lakes Victoria, Jessie, and Lahamadou. lakes that added enchantment and rich fishing. And again, too, this was a time before motorized boating. So fishing, the fishing guides and the fishermen really kind of wanted to be able to put their boats in right there and suddenly they could go from lake to lake. So opening of the Hotel Alexandria happened on July 20th, 1883, and the Alexandria Post reported that it was a gala event. And it said there were many visitors, including Secretary of State von Baumbach. During the day, the Colby's livery stables teams made regular trips between the Letzen House in Alexandria, the village, to the Alexandria Hotel grounds on Lake Geneva. Visitors reported the Alexandria Hotel to be a large, well-arranged hotel with large, airy rooms and wide, pleasant halls. The building was surrounded by a piazza and was surmounted by an observatory overlooking the surrounding country. And you may see that there is quite a good resemblance of this hotel to the Legacy of the Lakes Museum as we know it today. And going on with their gala grand opening, a new steamboat was on hand for the opening to accommodate visitors. While many sailed around the lake and enjoyed the scenery, others remained at the hotel to listen to the musical concert presented by the Alexandria Cornet Band. At the close of the evening, Mr. and Mrs. Letzen furnished a repast wherein nothing seemed lacking. A news report in the Douglas County News stated, the Hotel Alexandria, later known as the Geneva Beach Hotel, was the first resort hotel north of the Twin Cities. The resort was one of the best known summer resorts in the West. And that was also reported by the Alexandria Post. So Mr. Letzen's guests at his Minnetonka resort were wealthy people from Chicago and southern cities, especially St. Louis and Kansas City, coming north for a respite from the summer heat of the South. A number of these tourists followed Letzen to Alexandria and became the nucleus of an ever-expanding summer migration from the south to the cooling lakes of Douglas County. And so now, by the mid-1880s and into the 90s, Letzen had a hotel in Alexandria and also on the shores of Lake Geneva. 6th Avenue was extended eastward to provide a route from the village of Alexandria to the new hotel. In 1896, J.L. Dickinson, who was a nephew of Mr. Letzen, acquired the Alexandria Hotel and changed the name to Geneva Beach Hotel. Daily rates were $2, while weekly rates were offered at a discount. And when the Geneva Beach Hotel was rebuilt in 1917, you see they had a few fires, these grand hotels, because all of them were built with timber, native timber. Harry Dickinson, the son of J.L. Dickinson, called it the Dickinson Inn. So it was renamed for a while. And when that hotel was sold by the Dickinsons in 1930 to A.J. Dubois, the name was changed to the Geneva Beach Hotel. So it went through a few name changes, went through a few fires, like some of the other grand hotels. And for this particular hotel, in June of 1936, the property was sold to the Roberts Company of Minneapolis, operated it until 1943 when it was sold to Robert and Evelyn Brown, who then changed the name to Brown's Geneva Beach. And some of you might be familiar with that. Another grand hotel was Hotel Blake on Lake Carlos. Construction began in 1903 and it opened for business in 1905. John Blake and his wife built the Hotel Blake so that it fronted on Lake Carlos and was just across the road from Lake Lahamadou. Wealthy people from Texas, Oklahoma, and Missouri drove north to live at Blake's during the summer. And John Blake acquired his land from J.H. Brown, who owned much of the land on the east side of Lake Carlos and on Lake Darling. And if you're familiar with Alexandria, you know that there's also Browns Point. Today there's Browns Point Road along Darling, which is named after this gentleman. The Blakes were extremely smart with their hotel business in the fact that they provided quarters for chauffeurs as well as fishing guides. Fishing guides were really popular back in the day, and chauffeurs, you know, for these wealthy families, trunk loads of clothes for the women and the guests, and they spent their summer here. Fishing guides had room and board provided also. Novices were paid $12.50 a week, and the expert fishing guides got $3 a day. Hotel Blake had its first fire in 1910. Most of the guests lost everything, and they had to secure their lodging at the hotel on Geneva Beach. And they went through a few other fires for the Blake Hotel, and in 1923, Mr. Blake sold his property, Hotel Blake, for $30,000 to A.J. Dubois, who also had the Geneva Beach Hotel, and they changed the name to Blake's by the Lakes, which we know today with the condominiums that are located in that particular area. After the Blake survived another fire, it eventually found as it was reported, an inglorious end by rotting timber in a sea of weeds. And that is kind of how all of the grand hotels found their demise. One thing that the Dubois did when they had Blake's on the Lakes was they had, for several years, young Quinlan from Minneapolis set up a small shop in the hotel selling clothes and accessories and putting on style shows. And so there was something for everybody. The women were finding their place as well, while the men fished. Another hotel, grand hotel of the times, was the Maryland Hotel on Lake Mary. It was built by game warden O.J. Fuzzy Reynolds, whose wife was a very popular cook at the Dickinson Inn. And so Reynolds felt that many of the guests would follow her to the Maryland because of her fondness and their fondness for her cooking. So it was an amazing time, the teens, the 20s, the 30s, in the resort, the Grand Hotel era. And you were either Dickinson people, or you were Blake's people, or you were Geneva Beach people. You arrived at the same time every year. You got to know other families, and you stayed until about Labor Day. You would arrive by train, or as the roads improved, by car. You had the same accommodations, sat at the same table in the dining room, swam at the same appointed hour of 3 p.m. every day. And if the bell rang and it was nap time, the children knew it was time to come in and take their nap. They did everything the same every single year. So it's kind of fun to just think about how it was at the time. And also, I found a really interesting ad in 1912 Alexandria Citizen News, because while these hotels were not even starting yet, were already, things were changing. In 1912, Lakeshore's lots went from $75 to $300, according to size and location. And so for this limited time offer in this particular advertisement, from $5 to $25 down, you could get property and pay the balance due on monthly payments for your lake lot. But it was only a limited time offer. So times were changing once we got through the Grand Hotel era, and many of them found their demise by rotting timber or by fire. Times were changing with transportation as well. Like the railroad, new transportation was dictating tourism. More families became automobile owners, and an even greater need for accommodations became apparent, because resorts and the hotels were not just for the wealthy anymore, but for all families seeking recreation and relaxation at our lakes. Robert and Evelyn Brown, as I mentioned, did buy the Geneva Beach Dickinson Inn from the Roberts Company and renamed it to Brown's Geneva Beach in 1943. This was during World War II, and after the war, Brown's idea of a resort was dictated by the changing times. He, owner and manager, advertised bathing on a sandy beach, boating, good fishing, tennis, and golf. By 1945, when World War II ended, most families had automobiles, and Brown advertised what was known as an American plan. It advertised to attract not only the wealthy, but all families. His American Family Plan resort had excellent meals offered, served in the dining room. Guests could drive to the resort or be met at the train or bus station and arrange for transportation to and from area golf courses. So we were thinking too of what else is there to do at the lakes area. Prices for accommodations in his American plan had several different services, and fun varied from $5 a day per person and up, with excellent meals served in the hotel dining room. Special rates for children 12 and under and family groups. Robert Brown, owner and manager, advertised in a very, very progressive way. His season opened on Memorial Day and went on through Labor Day. So before the war, paid vacations were only a privilege of the very wealthy and very few, but that changed. Contractors began building small family cottages for wealthy families. Individual families were building on their own lots. The emergence of the automobile resulted in tourism progressing to the cabin camp era, with every family, just about every family, owning an automobile. The smaller resorts were well suited for families who wanted to get away to a lake for a week or two for their family vacation. They usually would buy their own groceries, and if they didn't, they'd often have a small convenience store right on the property for families to purchase some of their staple items. Because fishing was a chief recreation, a boat was furnished with each cottage. And the attraction as a tourist region was the fact that there were so many lakes in Alexandria to choose from. Of course, we had the wonderful chain of lakes. So the key in marketing was that there were many recreational things to do, and families could do them together, and they were advertised as such. Marketing and advertising had been key to Mr. Letson in the first place, and in attracting tourists, and that continued in new and innovative ways. And okay, I'll give you an instance. For instance, Miller's Cottage Inn, a summer resort on the north shore of Lake Lahamadou, which is also known as the Enchanted Beach or the Nebraska Beach. The Alexandria Post reported about Miller's Cottage Inn when it opened. Following the completion of it actually opened in 1924. Mrs. Miles Miller served over 100 people in her grand opening and a delicious chicken dinner at the formal opening of the Cottage Inn, the new summer resort on the north shore of Lake Lahamadou. Following the completion of the dinner, the visitors inspected the cottages, which have just been completed, and this was again in 1924. During the serving of the dinner, the One Step In dance orchestra played. After all the guests had been served, Miss Vivian Miller read very pleasingly The Lady of Charlotte. Mrs. Miller announces that she will serve chicken dinners at practically any hour of the day to parties who wish to take advantage of this service on short notice. From 1924 to 1946, Miller's Cottage Inn was a favorite dinner and tourist spot. The highest price ever charged for her dinner, chicken dinner, was $1.25, and the menu never changed. Addie and Art Berg are a perfect example of one of the ma and pa resorts that sprung up around the area back in the, during this time and after the war. And in the 50s, they came to Alexandria in 1955. They bought Casto's Resort and a home looking out over Lake Lahamadou, located on Government Bay. It had 3 cabins, and the Bergs ran it under the name of Casto's Resort at first. You see, Art had the idea, they were living in Minneapolis, and he had the idea that he wanted to get out in the rural area and buy a farm. Well, when they were driving around, they did not find a farm to buy, but they did find a resort to buy. And so in 1955, they began their business. Addie ran the resort while Art still worked in Minneapolis. And it was hard work. Each cabin came with its own dock, boat, and motor. Now, these are heavy. And they ran it during the season in 56. And in 1957, the entire family moved up to Alexandria permanently. And the resort was reopened under a freshly painted sign, Berg's Resort, mostly likely advertised under the Modern Housekeeping, Cottages, and Resorts advertisement. And again, it was hard work. Each cabin came with a dock and a motor, and Addie had to learn how to pull these out of the water herself. Heavy wooden boats, motors attached sometimes out of the water, and they raised their children, and they watched many things happen at every summer. They had romances that were blossoming. They had a baptism on the lake. They had a lawn wedding on the lake. And once a gentleman drove in claiming the lake was named after his relative who had been knighted by the Queen of England, Sir Lahamadu or Lumdu. So the mom and pops and resorts in Alexandria are starting to pop up. Also, today we still have Talina Road off County Road 42, but this club, this large house is no longer standing, but it was at the end of the road. In the early 1900s, a gentleman by the name of Alex McDonald built a beautiful big home on the crest of a hill overlooking water on 3 sides. And this is on the point across from Government Point on Lake Lahamadu that you see when you go into the bay. Later, after McDonald, Jack Campbell was the proprietor, and it was advertised as central Minnesota's most beautiful resort located on Campbell's Point. He renamed it. It was also known as Campbell's Point, and he advertised 12 rooms with bath. How much do you think it costs a day? $2 single room a day. Dine and dance every evening. Chicken and steak dinners are the specialty, and will reserve entire club for private banquets, conventions, and clubs. So things are changing again with this wonderful spot on Lake Lahamadu. After Jack Campbell, Charlie and Tom Rose came along, and they had Travelers Inn, the first owners of Travelers Inn, and they became proprietors of this establishment, and they renamed it Talina Country Club, named for Tom and Lena Rose, Tom's wife Lena, and that name has stuck. So it was a wonderful spot. They turned it into a popular supper club, the Talina Club, a combination of their names, and their grand opening advertisement was featured in the Park Region Echo in 1937 in July, and they had a dining room capacity for 175 people. After the club folded, later on, Paul Anderson owned the property, and he rented it, the house to St. Cloud State University. For 10 years or more, beginning in the 60s, the college operated as a teaching art colony, and that was known as Studio Lahamadu. And even later, the house was one time separated into apartments. And some people, residents here in Alexandria, have talked about when they were newlyweds and rented an apartment in this particular house. A sandbar joins Government Point to the other side of the bay to this Talina Point. And a couple different names for all of it. It was one time Cleveland's Point, once owned by Cleve Hicks, the son of A.W. Hicks, who was Knute Nelson's secretary for many, many years. Around the mid-40s, another sort of resort industry began with our lakes region. George Anderson was the new junior high school principal in Alexandria, and his brother Paul also was a teacher who taught in Minneapolis, and they had their summers free at the time, and they thought they needed a summer project. And so they came up with the concept of a dude ranch. where young people from the Twin Cities could probably come, where students could come and learn new things, or where they might want to go for a summer vacation. So in 1946, Paul and George Anderson purchased a rundown 70-acre farm adjacent to Lakes Darling and Alvin for $10,000. You see, it was a kind of an old farm with kind of swampy land, and it had outlived its farm use. But it has been said that they saw a most important thing when they saw this land, and that was potential. Again, the word potential. So in 1946, the property was exactly that. It gave a lot of potential for a new beginning. It had outlived its farm use, but it was, 70 acres of wooded land, and it had 4,000 feet of shoreline. So the two school teachers came up with $1,000 down payment and additional funds earmarked for capital investment. And that was secured by Reverend Alfred Secord, who was also a resident here in Alexandria. And he happened to trust Paul and George and helped them start their venture. So in 1947, the Anderson brothers authorized the first land development. They filled in the swampy area along the lakeshore and built 14 cabins on the site. And since the grounds were perfectly suited for camping, a camping development was created that was filled to 100% capacity on most weekends. The development of the cabins and campgrounds necessitating the building of 3 miles of new roads, 4 wells, and several sewage systems. So again, potential. The brothers decided very quickly that in order to ensure the success of their venture, it would be necessary to add some unique qualities that would set their place apart as a recreational resort. And so they were going to specialize in horseback riding, and later when motorized boating became really big, in water skiing, and also offering lessons in how to do horseback riding and how to water ski. And they later added golf in that whole mix of things. So as the Anderson brothers worked on their ranch, about 1958, Jack Movald had a plan which was to create big boat channels between the lakes, and he asked for community involvement, and again, a vision, and asking the community for help in this vision. So the heads of 6 major organizations, the Chamber of Commerce, City Council, Alexandria Developers, the Alexandria Resort Association, and the Rotary Club, volunteered to appoint representatives from their respective groups to a committee to promote Movald's idea. He said that boating was the hottest new thing in the vacation industry, and that those tourist areas that plan to capitalize on the boom in boating would be the areas that would prosper the most. And so the resort and tourist industry was growing by the work of our leaders. Hospitality has been one of the largest industries in Alexandria and all of Douglas counties from the beginning, but in the mid-50s, late 50s into the 60s, it was really progressing further by the potential of and the vision that our business leaders saw, and also by listening to the experts, Jack Movald, who said, you know what? Motorized boating is the new hot thing. We better get prepared for it, and we should be able to pass from channels from one lake to another, and think of what we have here. And so thinking back to the Anderson brothers with their Darling Dude Ranch, they thought, well, it has a lot of variety for guests, but we need to be accessible to add more things. So they did add the water skiing lessons because of the motorized boating growth, and also golfing. And golfing has been a huge tourist attraction also because of our lakes. So by 1966, the brothers changed their emphasis to a resort angle instead of just a dude ranch that offered, lessons in water skiing and golf. And they had another vision, and that was a motel with an indoor swimming pool. Now, this is a first also. This would enable them to operate in the winter as well as the summer. And so in February of 1969, the Park Region Echo reported that a $1 million building program would expand Darling Dude Ranch to also accommodate a year-round tourist and convention facility. And they made the announcement that they were going to go ahead and begin building this. In 1970, a fabulous all-season service featuring the new and unusual new building came into being, and construction began. And that was 50 years ago that construction began on Arrowwood. And the resort actually opened in 1971. It opened as a year-round resort convention center with a restaurant, cocktail lounge, indoor swimming pool, saunas, game and recreational rooms, in addition to facilities for skiing, skating, sleigh rides, and snowmobiling over its 420 acres. So just think about the potential that just by an old worn out farm area on Lake Darling with vision of our business leaders came to be. In 1981, the executive vice president of the Chamber of Commerce, Jim Clayton, stated in the newspaper, "We are mostly a ma and pa resort area with the exception of Arrowwood. Our largest places have about 22 units. With the exception of Arrowwood." Arrowwood was just being, really publicized, and in St. Paul Pioneer Press article in 1981 talked of another new trend that is dotting the resort industry, and that is condominiums and townhouses. And so again, too, the resort industry in Alexandria is growing by leaps and bounds. And so our business leaders were all very responsible in the growth and the potential that we have here. But I'm going to just back up for a minute. In 1907, the Businessmen's Association led the way for local business to promote the village of Alexandria in other ways, as well as with our lake legacy. Later known as the Commercial Club, the organization officially took the name Chamber of Commerce in 1928. And that is the same year 10 businessmen purchased the Kensington runestone from Jalmar Holland. And the members of the Chamber of Commerce were the first to display the runestone at their old location of 608 Broadway. And in 1955, the Chamber President Lee Johnson found the stone stashed away in storage for a period of, it had been stored in a vault and in the basement, and Johnson and Dunow carried the stone up the basement only to find an attorney at the top of the stairs with a court order saying, "Do not remove." It didn't take long for the local businessmen to take steps toward finding a permanent home for the Kensington runestone, while at the same time finding a home for the Chamber of Commerce. And so the Chamber of Commerce, I like to mention it here in this part of the story of our legacy of the lakes, that was really instrumental in promoting what we have to offer in our tourist industry. In 1957, Chamber records show that Rock Anderson, Harlan Engen, Marvin Lundeen, and Earl Lamb, as Chamber officials, began making plans to sell their old spot and build this new headquarters, which we have pictured here. And it's fun to just mention, drop some names, see if you can pick up any of the names from our past and just really give them a lot of credit for what we have today. Here we have the little white hut that used to be in the center of 2nd Avenue and Broadway. And it was business organizations that were promoting our lake's history and our lake, what we had to offer, the hotels, the cabins, the ma and pa resorts, the different things that Alexandria had to offer here. I love this picture of the little hut because, they've got, it just is very reminiscent of what old Alexandria looked like. And maybe some of you who are watching tonight remember this particular hut. Again, promoting with brochures and with flyers and with newspaper advertisements. And again, too, people looking for accommodations when they come to do their summer vacations here in Alexandria. So I can't help but not mention the golfing and the resorters, since that just wrapped up last week, that the resort industry proved successful in offering things besides just lake activities. Golfing has been a huge part of our resort industry and the legacy of the lakes. The first land for a golf course in Alexandria was purchased in 1916. It was actually in 1923 that the Alexandria Golf Club was still only a 9-hole course. So it was in that year that the Carl Schultz farm on the Lake Darling side was purchased. And in the beginning, the first 9 was on the other side of the lake on the Lahamadou side. And in 1923, the Alexandria Golf Club was, the Carl Schultz farm was purchased. And so that became the first 9, and the original property became the second 9 on the Bay of Lahamadou. A little bit confusing, but it just gives you an idea how, again, we expanded. And if you think and close your eyes for a minute and think about, you know, all of this area that's developed today used to be farmland, and it's just been developed through the years. So of course we had the resorts tournament, and I couldn't help not mention them tonight. It was a huge part of the club's history, as well as a huge part of our Alexandria history. In fact, this year was the 99th annual resorters tournament. And so it became and began as a tourist trade possibility. The Post News proclaimed the possibilities: automobile, bus lines, golf links, and municipal heating discussed at a meeting of the commercial club. Brainstorming for the promotion of tourist trade and the development of wasteland surrounding the lakes. Some of this land, again, too, the Anderson brothers, that was considered a farm that kind of was wasteland. And here we have wasteland, again, that's been made into beautiful golf course. So the first tournament was held 5 years after the first purchase in 1916, and Dr. L.M. Boyd was president of the club, the first club president. I guess they had to use the lights of the automobiles to wind up the golfing at night, because some of the play got a little bit late. But it's always been a big part of our history, that's for sure. And I have to mention, of course, Boat Eriksson, since we are sitting in this lovely museum here tonight, or I am anyway, that Eriksson, Boat Eriksson, began his boat works here in Alexandria. He was 17 when he built his first wooden boat, and he, you know, wasn't really into all that much farming. He liked to build boats instead, and so that's what he did. And when he began building launches with inboard motors as time went on, and he got more and more orders, and he was kept busy. I think the Lady of the Lakes boat might be in here tonight, I'm not sure. Winding up here as we take some time for questions. Oh my goodness, we're already at 8 o'clock. We can't forget the fishing guides. I mentioned them. They were provided with the resorts and the hotels early on, and there were times when a guide took a party out in the morning, caught their limit, regrouped, and returned in the afternoon for a repeat, and limits were kept. For the fishermen, the problem was not always about whether they'd catch any fish. It was about how are we going to get to our fishing spot. Because they had not the best road transportation to lug boats with, and they also started out without motorized boats. But fishing guides had board and room provided, and as I mentioned before, and the Missouri Angling Club on Lake Minnetonka was founded as long ago as 1890, and in its heyday it employed 11 fishing guides and served over 120 meals a day. Let's wind up this evening then, and I hope we still have time for some questions if you have any, or we can figure that out, how we can get questions from you and try to answer them. I just want to remind that, you know, this beautiful lakes area is not only for the visiting folks, but it's for all of us here who live here. We're engaged in many different activities that are part of our life, our daily life in the summertime. Of course, hard work occupies much of our time during the week, but the weekends and the evenings are all about recreation. We had a water ski club. I think many of you know who was on that team. Les Engstrom here pictured, I know he was part of the team. There was boating, there was water skiing, there was picnicking, there were groups meeting, family reunions, all kinds of fun. City Park on Lake Henry was really in its heyday, just a wonderful spot to, bus loads of kids would come. And I was on one of those buses coming from Evansville to swim at City Park in Lake Henry. And of course, because of the lakes, we have all kinds of other activities going on. We have the county fair, we have 4-H, we have growth here. We have lots of, the legacy of 4-H because of T.A. Eriksson here. And just so many opportunities and the potential for so many recreational and interests to, for everybody because of our lakes and bringing people here to enjoy what we have, including our beautiful Lake Carlis State Park on the northwest side of Lake Carlis. And we are lucky enough to have a state park within driving distance for us. And so many great things with that park that is offered to us, not only as residents, but also to visiting folk here that can enjoy our lakes. Just the chain that's attached, the 7 lakes that make up our chain, as well as all the lakes that are around Douglas County, over 200 lakes in Douglas County alone. So we certainly can find our favorite lake to go to. I will close with that, Casey. I apologize for not having allowed any questions to come in, but I encourage you to, if you want to find out more information, go to the Douglas County Historical Society. The old newspaper archives have excellent tidbits of information that's where I get all my information, just by reading, and then enjoying. And as you have probably figured out tonight, my passion is the history of Douglas County and this local history, and especially a passion for the lakes history and the resort industry. There's wonderful exhibits here at the museum that you want to take in and just enjoy reading all about it. There's so much. There's really so much to share.
We can take a few questions if anybody has any that they want to submit down into the Q&A portion at the bottom of their screen. If anybody has any questions, you were very comprehensive. So as a
went kind of fast because I realized I was on a on a time limit here, and I really I've got a question here.
We do have a question. Are there any notable area lakes that have had different names over the years? For example, I saw on an old map that Lake Minnewaska used to be called Whipple Lake back in the 1800s. Just curious.
I do. In fact, maps are the best source of finding that out. I'll give you one, for instance, and some lakes are gone. If you look at the early maps, 1866, and on some lakes are even gone. I have a program that I talk specifically about how the lakes were named. And Lake Evelyn, for instance, that's by Arrowwood, that at one time, there's the golf course at Atiqua that I think some people would like to change probably the name of Lake Evelyn to Lake Atiqua. So, I don't have all of that information in front of me at the moment, but if you
we're just gonna have you do another presentation.
Yeah, how the lakes are named. It's really fun. It's a fun subject because and some of the lake names have changed, and actually some of the lakes have disappeared.
Wow. So the next one is, do you know where the Maryland Hotel was on?
Not specifically. I'm not that familiar with that. I would suggest going to the Douglas County Historical Society and follow up with that question. There, they probably have the specific location of where that was.
Okay.
I apologize. The water skiing slide that was on the gangplank, that was the gangplank. It was the gangplank. It was a hexagonal, and it was also the roller rink back when I was in high school. But yes, that was it, the gangplank.
So for everybody who can't see the question, somebody asked what the building was on the water on the last slide. So was asking if it was the gangplank. So
yes, yes.
Doing that.
And when they brought the gangplank to Alexandria, it's my understanding that they brought it piece by piece and built it. And the Dubois, I believe, were the party that were responsible for building getting the gangplank there. And it had a few other names. Most recent, what my age group probably would have been the gangplank. And then we did roller skate there. Yes, and that was, I believe, for the question about the Maryland, was on Lake Mary, my understanding.
Okay. If nobody else, oh, wait, let's see. Oh, you are very knowledgeable, Rachel. Thank you for being with us tonight. As a transplant to the area, this was like the best comprehensive history I could have asked for. So it was really wonderful. And thank you everybody for attending the talk tonight. Don't forget, we do have another talk on September 14th about invasive species, which I know is a hot topic in our lakes. So let's preserve that. We're the guys back in the early days who were like, preserve and keep our lakes clean. So this is what we can do to help. So again, thank you all for joining us tonight, and have a good evening.
Thank you.